My house is haunted, I was told. To be honest, I purchased it before the warning. Furthermore, the agent did not conceal its gruesome past. She filled me in on everything. The wife had escaped with a young lover approximately 20 years prior. That made the husband crazy, and he killed their little girl because she looked too much like her mother. Since then, the house has gone through several ownership changes, with the most recent owners hastily leaving for Europe because of some kind of family emergency. I gave the agent credit for being truthful. Compared to similar properties in the area, the house is 20% less expensive. She gave me a pursed-lipped look. She wore a smart suit, was in her late 40s, and was in good shape. She made me think of Julie Andrews for some reason. In my experience, people won't hesitate for whatever little superstitious reason when a deal this fantastic is offered. This house won't remain on the market for very long, in my opinion. Taking the hint, I made the offer. Really, it was a pretty small house. It was outfitted with sturdy wooden furniture and soft rugs in each room. I moved in over the course of an afternoon, with just my one suitcase of clothes and very little else, and I took my first walk around my new house. A charming small spot. There is a lot of rustic appeal, such as the living room sofa squeaking and paint peeling off the walls. I thought about calling my relatives to inform them of my move. Only my brother, who lived abroad anyhow, would give a damn, and he had no intention of coming. I don't despise my family or anything. Simply said, we are complex. I cuddled up on the sheets that still smelled like the store and slept restlessly in my new bed that night. In my dream, I saw an elderly man in tattered clothing with long, wispy hair, who was so malnourished that it was a marvel he was able to stand. A river was also running through the hills. I was worried when I woke up. The following day, I received my first warning. A little girl, maybe 10 years old, bumped into me as I was making my way home. She landed right on her ass after we both yelled. "Are you okay?" I got her up. She gave me a suspicious squint. "Who are you?" I was surprised at the question. "I live here." I indicated the direction of my home. She narrowed her eyes even further. "Now this is where I live." "Oh, Olivia," a young woman approached. Under all the makeup, the girl was barely 16. Avoid creating a scene. "Are you our newest neighbor? My name is Kathy." Indeed, I recently relocated to Not 20. After giving me a critical look, Kathy leaned over to adjust her shoe and offer me a good look at her cleavage. I grinned awkwardly. "Oh," Olivia's gaze widened. "Is he the resident of the haunted house?" The ridiculousness of the scary film nearly made me laugh. This young woman with her innocent, all-American face, ponytails, and mini t-shirt was informing me about the spirit in my house after I had recently moved into a house with a violent past. Haunted. She enjoys making up ridiculous stories, so just ignore her. Mama's waiting for you. Then Kathy pulled her sister away. I looked intently at the mirror when I washed my hands at home. Staring back was a slender man with deep wrinkles around his sunken, weary eyes. Indeed, I didn't look well, and to make matters worse, I was wearing a blouse that was 3 sizes too big. Even though ladies at that age tried their sexuality on everyone they encountered, it's a surprise why Kathy thought I was worth enticing. Ironically, my brother texted me right then and there, and my phone vibrated with a text that said, "Hey son, this came up in my Instagram feed." I instinctively wrote back that Dennis had called me overnight. I never answered the text. "Nick, I haven't heard from you in a long time. How are you? Have you been eating healthily?" Dennis is doing a great job portraying a middle-aged aunt. I had another dream about the elderly man that night, wobbling as he went among long grass stalks. Even though he had to work very hard at every step, he continued on his way through the hills to my small house. I shivered as I woke up. Even though I knew I was safe, I sat in bed till the break of day, sweating through my IKEA covers. I thought I heard something rustling in the kitchen as I was falling back asleep, but it might have been a dream. The following morning, I saw Olivia once more. She was attempting to mend her school bag's damaged strap. I did my best to tie it off. "Thank you, now it functions." "No issue, youngster. I'm sorry, but it's possible that my house isn't haunted. At least I haven't yet encountered any ghosts." She is shy, which is why. Apprehensive? Indeed. It takes her a long time to emerge. Really, she's not mean. She simply wants to have fun because she is bored. As she recounted the local urban legend to me, the child's eyes glowed with morbid excitement. How well kids adapted to frightening stories is astounding. I questioned whether Olivia considered the fact that the alleged ghost was only a few years her junior. However, it would likely make the experience much more exciting. There was a sound emanating from the living room when I first arrived home, barely audible, so faint that I was unable to identify it, almost like, is the TV operational? However, I had undoubtedly not touched it. I went to check nevertheless, but the ancient, beaten TV that came with the house was dead. A drab, dust-covered box without a remote control. The noises of TV certainly working awakened me up that night. My entire body was stiff as I jumped up in bed. I eventually slithered out from under my covers and made my way to the living room. I had to know what was happening. That antique television was there, showing a vibrant cartoon. At 2 a.m, whose channel even aired children's cartoons? I looked for a remote control while attempting to think of a non-supernatural explanation. However, ghost stories were quite compelling in the dark. After a while, I located the remote control, switched off the TV, and attempted to exit the room. An unholy screech echoed through the house as I grabbed the doorknob, and I, too, let out a scream. In a desperate search, I discovered that the TV was back on. The innocuous children's song was transformed into a loud cacophony by the cartoon characters singing, which was played at full intensity. My palms were shaking and sweating as I reached for the remote. The sounds and annoyances persisted after then. Randomly, the radio and TV would turn on. I'd leave a slice of cake or a sandwich on a counter and discover it was just partially consumed. And occasionally, when I tried to go to sleep, I could hear it, the happy, uncontrollable laughter of a child. I obstinately persisted in spite of all these warning signs, skulking around my home's dusty hallways, growing thinner and paler with every new day. One wet November night, everything came to a head. I was feverish and sweaty when I went to bed. My sleep was disturbed by strange noises coming from all throughout the home. At one point, I turned and tossed before turning to face the window. I noticed the elderly man there, leaning against the glass. His mouth widened, smearing the glass pane with dirt from his lips and tongue. I thrashed out of bed and yelled. Although I was aware that it was a dream, my dread overcame me, and I staggered down the hallway without thinking. She was a little girl in a pink dress when I first met her. After getting her hair done, she had to deal with a broken and destroyed mess, where her father had struck her 5 times with a club in an attempt to wipe that whore smile off her face. She turned to face me, tilting her head curiously to one side while holding pieces of her skull in place with her tiny hands. Then she was gone. I was clammy, naked, and furious as I stood in my hallway. I had had enough of the bullshit. I sold the radio and TV in a day. I was never a huge fan anyhow. As soon as I got home, I immediately went to bed and stopped eating and even showing up there throughout the day. I was going to switch off the lights when I received my brother's call. In sharp contrast to my own feeble tone, his voice boomed through the line. "How are you, Nick?" "Been better." "Dude, you sound half dead. Are you ill? What's the matter? Have you been eating properly?" A drop of dark liquid struck my hand, saying, "I've made some stupid choices. Yes, I made a huge mistake, but I will be all right. Do you need help?" I felt a surge of affection and tenderness for my brother. He was always there for me, no matter what else he was. "No, I understand." I looked up as another drop hit my face. Through the ceiling, blood started leaking. When it realized I was no longer interested in playing, the object in my house became irate. Its nighttime laughs became terrifying shrieks. Blood-soaked rugs squelched beneath my feet. Whole bookshelves and dish racks were smashed or ripped to pieces on the ground. I cowered from the noises and did not try to conceal, spending the days in the living room. Finally, she came for me. She was a different person. Her body was horribly malformed and bloated. Bits of bone and brain slipped out of her broken head as blood ran down her body. I was getting water in the kitchen when she arrived on top of the stairs. She lowered herself toward me and screamed loudly. As she came closer, I whimpered and fell to the ground. All I could do was that. And consider the irony. 20 years prior, when her father went downstairs with the club, she had been in the identical location in the kitchen. She lunged for me when she realized I was scared, much like her father must have realized that day. I confronted her head-on, defeated her, and ate her alive. Of course she tried to fight. Those apparitions, whatever they are, she was not strong enough. All of the terror she had witnessed in me back then had only served as a lure to incite her rage and boldness. Normally, I would have waited for her to gain some weight, but I was pressed for time. I ate her until I was completely gone, and then I fell asleep on the kitchen floor. I slept soundly for the first time in a long time. I ran up the stairs to take a shower in the morning. I looked in the mirror and realized that I was a tall, well-built man with wrinkles gone from my face and shiny black curls in my hair once more. I emailed my brother a selfie that I took while grinning. It's okay to be a little conceited, even at my age. It looks good, he said nearly right away. When will you come over here? You're not interested in seeing your nieces? After putting the phone down, I jumped in the shower. I saw the skeletal old man, who was no longer threatening, standing directly behind me in the mirror. I gave him my full attention. On this occasion, I was too close. However, the horrifying messenger gradually vanished into thin air as I stared. I have been eating, after all. That was not the case here. Like many other unnatural creatures, the hammock monster is resilient. When a firearm was fired at it, it shrugged. I mistook its hesitation to interact for weakness. I should not be too shocked, I guess. Even if I knew I would live, I wouldn't be particularly excited to be shot with a rifle, either. Of course, I have another weapon from my arsenal, one capable of killing inhuman creatures. The harvesters gave me the knife. My great-aunt's bones were used to make that one. I was not able to utilize myself as bait. The hammock monster lulled its victims to sleep before coming near, so that was too dangerous. If I was asleep, I couldn't really stab it in the face. In the same way, even if Ed claimed to be quite rested and would be content to nap again as long as the old sheriff was around, I didn't want to use any of my employees as bait. I told him that I needed someone who could stay up late and praised him for his selflessness, someone capable of keeping the hammock monster stationary long enough for me to approach and stab it. I so sat with a bottle of brandy on my front porch early in the morning and patiently waited. Bo showed up as usual for his knife drills. But this time, rather of waiting in the yard, he approached the porch and gave the brandy a noticeable glance. He remarked, "You didn't have to call for me." "It felt right," I answered. "This is for you." "I also need something." I gave him the brandy and he put it in a pocket behind him. Since I still don't know where else he gets his own knives, I've started to assume that the pocket is a pocket dimension. His voice was low with boiling rage as he told me, "I'm not like your staff. It is not enough to just tell me what you want and expect me to comply." This was what I had anticipated. After all, it was the way these things operated. I wouldn't risk it. Think of this as a suggestion. I believe you will enjoy it. I explained my plans to him and my expectations of him. As I spoke, his expression softened, and by the conclusion, a slender, feral smile had appeared on his face. His eyes were glistening with venom in anticipation. I admit that his propensity to use violence against his own people might worry me a little, but I'm not the type of guy who can pass judgment. I barely have clean hands. The plan was quite straightforward. Bo only needed to pretend to be asleep in the hammock, I told him, and then he could reach up and tear off the monster's eye stalks when it approached. I would then rush in and stab it with my knife while it was staggering around blind. Cooperation. That's all. Plan B was that. He said, "Why don't I just stab it myself?" Once I finished. "This doesn't operate that way, does it?" I answered. "This is my territory. I must be the one to stand up for it." With the gentlest nod, he lowered his head. Indeed, this was the way it operated. And for once, there was a rare look of approval on his face as I passed this little test of his. After deciding on a plan, I radioed my employees to inquire about any sightings of hammocks. "Not yet," they said. When we located one, I promised Bo that I would call him once more before carrying out the plan. I told him he wouldn't get another bottle. I wasn't willing to spend all of my own grocery budget on him, and I had already purchased the good brandy. That caused me to look annoyed, and as a result, our relationship was balanced again. My workers didn't discover a strange hammock for several days. It was hanging in a nice spot, with enough of sunlight to ward off the chilly wind. Additionally, it was situated far from any of our present campers. There, Bo greeted me. When I pulled there on my four-wheeler, he was already there, though I'm not really sure how he knew. I informed him that I would set up shop so that I could observe the area, while hopefully the hammock monster wouldn't be able to see me. I would have to physically remove myself, and it might take me a minute to get near enough to use the knife. He would have to prevent the hammock monster from running away like it had done before. Bo didn't appear to care. He sat in the hammock and said, "Really, Kate, are you certain I can't manage myself?" I shot back, "I seem to remember that after someone chipped your cup, you were in a coma for weeks on end." He swung his legs up into the hammock and gave me a glare. He yelled, "It wasn't just a chip." After giving it some thought, he pushed the cup in my direction. I accepted it without giving it any thought, behaving more reflexively as a surprise that a skull had just been forced into my chest. He said, "Hold on to it for me." He no longer had to caution me to use it with care. I was aware. I took it in one hand and held it close to my chest. If the cup wasn't there, he would look more like a typical human. I wasn't sure if he was trying to hide something from the hammock monster or if it was because the skull was too difficult to hide while lying in a hammock. Although it was tempting to inquire, Bo had already closed his eyes and folded his arms across his chest. It brought back memories of his unconscious state on my couch. Instead of the comfort you might anticipate from someone sleeping, it was a convenient position. "Are you really sleeping?" I growled. "I don't." His eyes didn't even open. I murmured, "Well, you look like a corpse." I'm hoping the hammock monster is tricked. Plan C is not something I want to try. Plan C was a smart idea, U/GuamPit 2707, but I'm not sure how to implement it. I moved back to my observation spot and bided my time. Sincerely, I radioed Brian to come retrieve the cup. Trying to hold onto it while using my knife was not something I wanted to do. After everything was finished, Brian returned it, rather than me, and Bo didn't appear to complain. So I believe that was a wise choice. It felt like a little more than an hour, but I'm not sure how long I waited after that because I was trying not to glance at my phone, because sometimes ignorance is bliss. The hammock monster proceeded across the grass toward the two trees it was suspended between, after sneaking out of the forest. It paused beside Bo's head and extended its elongated appendages. Tensing up, I prepared to start running. Bo would suddenly start moving, reach up and seize the creature's eyeballs before tearing them from its skull. Now a minute. The hammock monster put its hands on either side of Bo's forehead, and I watched with increasing horror. Threads that sparkled dully, like tarnished silver, came with it as it spread its fingers and pulled them back. It started weaving them back and forth between its fingers. The start of cat's cradle. Bo might not sleep, but he was definitely not cognizant at that precise time. I believe I would have enjoyed the irony of having to go save Bo if things weren't so dire. I was profoundly troubled, as it were. Bo had been trapped by the hammock monster. BEAU. Something non-human. I gripped the knife's hilt and made an effort to relax. I was unable to feel upset. When I was upset, I was reckless. I fumbled with the knife more than I fought, as if my rage would compel the world to neatly place my target in the blade's path. For the record, that doesn't work. I then ascended effortlessly into a run. Since I seem to have to run a lot, I've also started doing it. As I closed the yards between us, the hammock creature remained motionless. I used my offhand to brace the knife's hilt and mentally projected its path. Where the creature's ribs are. To the front, slide it around, the abdomen should be opened. It would undoubtedly become incapacitated from such a severe wound, giving me valuable time when it would be unable to defend itself, and I could cut its throat. Now it's just a few feet. Despite everything I've done, my fear has always been there, screaming for me to quit, that I couldn't allow myself to collide with this awful creature with its strange eyes and skin blankets. The key to overcoming fear is perseverance. Give yourself over to your momentum. So I did just that. And just as the knife was about to bite, the hammock monster peered up at me. Those lidless eyes looked straight into mine as its eye stalks turned. I have a weak will, Bo had stated. I wasn't weak. Before I knew it, the scolding was a tight knot of resentment that rapidly turned to wrath in my breast. He's a jerk. Now that he had failed, I had to do this on my own. But hasn't it always been that way? While my family and the town watch and silently condemn me for something they could never do, I stand alone against the horrors of this campsite. One palm was lifted by the hammock monster. Only a few strings looped around the fingers of its other hand remained after the cords that connected it to Bo faded from that hand. But Bo remained still, and I fell into the mud, thrashing my limbs madly in the mud that deadened my movements and dragged me down inexorably. I was drowning in the mire. I knew that as soon as I gasped for air, it would be over, so I pushed my lips together tightly. Down, submerged beneath silty layers, there was no light. This was a location I knew. I had already been here when it attempted to erase my mother's memory. It wasn't attempting to feed, though, this time. I was just going to get killed. My hair was grabbed. It pulled me up with a yank, and I grabbed onto the person's wrist, despite the pain. I was suddenly ripped clear of the mud and gulped down the foul air. With his lips thinned in disgust, Bo stood in front of me. He groaned and said, "I guess we're doing this the hard way then." I was too confused at the moment to ask him what he meant by that. I was surveying my surroundings, observing the skeletal, lifeless trees that loomed in every direction. I wondered how I was drowning in the mud earlier when it was only knee-deep. I could see a shadowy reflection of myself on its surface, and it gleamed with a slight silver sheen in the diffused light. Bo reflected a lot. 6, maybe 7 pictures of men and women, each with a different appearance and attire, but all with the same flat face that barely covered a trace of contempt, fanned out from him in a ring. The reflections shifted when I blinked, and I looked down at a whole other group of individuals. I forced myself to look at the issue at hand by tearing my eyes out of the muck. I said, "Where are we?" Bo's expression became contemplative as he glanced about. As he thought, he brought a palm to his lips, and a ring clinked softly against a lip piercing. He said, "I remember clawing my way out of this morass." "You were in my campground after that," I recommended. I had the impression that he didn't truly see me, even though he turned and faced me, as if he were looking directly into my eyes and beyond them. "No, I was somewhere else first." Pause. He took a quick breath. "Your land is unique. You understand this, don't you?" His sentences tightened around my heart, as if the sharp points of their consonants were piercing my heart. This was also what my mother had said. Our terrain was unique. "What do you mean?" With a low, focused voice, I asked. "Well..." He was preoccupied. I questioned whether he was even aware of what he had just said. However, I was given a clue as to where we were by that recall of my mother and the memories I always held in the back of my mind. "Isn't this the subconscious?" Grimly, I asked. "But this time, it's not mine. You own it." With natural ease, he declared, "I'm not human." He has now reminded me numerous times. This is not my subconscious, and I understand my nature far better than humans can on their own. Where are we then? I gazed down at all of his reflections. When I wasn't looking, they had changed. Now, different folks. There were so many faces looking up at me with barely veiled contempt in their eyes, and without a smile. Regardless of his appearance, Bo remained the same. Regardless of who was dragged inside, nothing had changed here either. Where monsters are born, I muttered. That's our location. That collective human psyche that conjures up nightmares to haunt us at night and fill us with fear during the day. Creatures that sprang from our common fears of dying, suffering, and powerlessness. My family was always fascinated in horror films, TV series about paranormal investigations, books about the paranormal, etc. when I was growing up. As a child, I was aware of ghosts and poltergeists, just as casually as I was aware of Santa and the Tooth Fairy, since my mother and grandparents were quite open about the fact that the house we lived in was haunted. After a great deal of research, I found that poltergeists were legal. But as I've gotten older and learned more about my family, I'm coming to the conclusion that it's the other way around. My family doesn't care about the paranormal because we were haunted by it. No, our fascination with the paranormal, in particular my grandfather Bill, is the reason we are haunted. Yes, because of him, he died of cancer about 10 years ago. My grandmother, aunt, mother, siblings, and I were constantly harassed, unsettled, and occasionally completely terrified by the activities of invisible entities in not only my childhood home, but also the homes of my grandparents, aunt, and other relatives. Sincerely, it makes much more sense why, when I was a child and my school friends would discuss ghosts and eerie stories, they either didn't have a haunted house or believed they might have one, and that was that. In contrast, not only was my house haunted, but almost every member of my family was. During these storytelling sessions, I used to really control and restrain myself in case someone thought I was insane or worse, dishonest. How unlucky is it that all of my family members just happen to move into houses that are so alive with activity from the dead, was a question I used to ask myself. I read a 22-page book called How to Have a Happy Home by David Yerst. It all began in the 1970s. When my mother was a teenager, my aunt was a young child, and my grandmother, Joyce, and grandfather, Bill, were a young married couple just starting out in their new home in a small town just outside of Edinburgh, Scotland. I now realize that it is not the houses that are haunted, but rather the people who live there. Bill was always crazy and out of the ordinary. He even told me as a child that the little TM at the end of some magazine words meant toe monster, and that when you saw it, the toe monster would come at the end of your bed that night to steal your toes. By holding up a teaspoon and allowing the toe monster to see its own reflection, you could defeat it and force it to give up. He had always been fascinated by the concept of extraterrestrial life and was working on a book that he never finished. In the 1990s, he attempted to get it published, but was told he needed to dumb it down. This work was passed down to my brother after Bill's death, and my brother's hobbies and intelligence are very similar to Bill's. Bill had a very high level of intelligence. He was also strange, but in a good way. Enjoyable until it wasn't. My grandmother was unaware that Bill was experimenting with a homemade Ouija board when he was upstairs reading and writing, while she was taking care of their 2 girls. My grandmother and other family members have informed me of all of this, as well as the other events that will occur in this series. From a situation, oddly enough, my grandmother also had one Ouija board incident as a child, in science class of all places. A Ouija board was brought in by their science teacher, and my grandmother, who was reared in a very devout household and was pretty young, didn't like it and thought it was scary, especially when the pointer started moving across the board. She and the other females around the board just kind of chuckled nervously or remained silent as it moved around and spelled the name Dan Isle at random, because it was a split boys and girls school, and it was the one boy's name to be spelled Dana. That name had no meaning for years, but my grandmother, would have an experience that brought it back to her in a very startling and traumatic way. In the 1950s, my grandmother was raising 2 kids while working as a bakery manager while they were in school. In the 1970s, my grandfather was working night shifts as a security guard and being strange and smart in his free time. The story of my family and the paranormal really starts with the occurrence I'm about to share with you. After putting my mother and aunt to bed, my grandmother took a seat in her own bed and soon fell asleep. After returning home from his security night shifts, my grandfather would frequently either remain up to write or simply fall asleep on the couch so as not to wake my grandmother. Bill was downstairs after returning from one of his security stints at the local shopping center, knowing that his wife and children were sleeping upstairs, when he heard my grandmother yelling in terror. He ran upstairs without missing a beat, and even my mother and aunt had woken up and fled their bedroom. Holding them back, my grandfather entered the master bedroom, where my grandmother was still yelling, sitting upright in bed, leaning to the side as though avoiding something, but there was nothing there. My grandfather asked her what it was, thinking she had had a terrible nightmare, and he was surprised by what she said. To the joy of Bill, who had always been fascinated by the paranormal and supernatural, she was fairly pious and at the time did not believe in them or even think about them. However, this night altered all of that. My grandmother told Bill that she had heard Bill enter the house from work and that she had woken up. When she opened her eyes, she saw a black, shadowy figure in the corner of the dark bedroom. My grandmother initially believed she was seeing things, so she gazed at it more intently and for a longer period of time, letting her eyes become used to the darkness. She was astounded by what she saw when her eyes finally adjusted. My grandmother now gets goosebumps whenever she talks about this, and the first time she told me the tale, she actually got tears in her eyes and a lump in her throat. This is not a woman telling the story of a bad dream. This woman describes how she saw someone or something in the ostensibly private and secure setting of her own bedroom in her own house, and how it altered the way she perceived the world. In the shadowed corner of the room, a tall, broad-shouldered man was kneeling on its knees. According to my grandmother, he had gray skin, a pale yellow tunic-like covering, and appeared to be formed of stone. She said that his face, which appeared to be carved rather than just made of stone, resembled something in between an Easter Island face and a real human face. The head has a massive nose, large ears, a tall, wide forehead, large lips that are firmly closed, and dark, black, nearly rectangular holes where eyes should be. She was able to discern this level of detail and was aware of what she was seeing. She didn't know who or what it was, but she was staring at it in silent shock. Before she could come up with any thought, it started to move across the floor toward her, while remaining on its knees and without tensing up. Its head, arms, and legs did not move, and it made no sound. It moved slowly toward my grandmother, who was kneeling in her bed and terrified. It reached the side of her bed and loomed over her, just inches away. My grandmother gazed up at this unsettling, concrete-looking creature, and she explained how, in a single, quick motion, its torso appeared to turn so that it was staring down at her. The long black holes where eyes would be suddenly lit with a pulsating red glow, my grandmother recalled, almost directly. As if it weren't horrifying enough, my grandmother heard the word demonial in her mind almost telepathically in a loud, booming voice that wasn't derived from its immobile, stone-lipped lips clamped tightly together. Unable to stand it any longer, she unfrozen from her terrified condition and yelled with the voice in her brain and the burning red eyes. My grandfather couldn't believe what he was hearing when she had finished telling him this story. He had never seen something like it, even as a believer, and he never would have imagined his wife saying she had. That night, and every night after that, my grandmother slept in her daughter's bedroom until they moved, which she assured Bill they would do as quickly as possible. On her way home from school one day, my mother happened to spot a house for sale, which is where they relocated to and where my gran still resides now. My gran kept an eye out for the next available house in the vicinity. Unfortunately, moving wasn't the answer she had hoped for. Unfortunately, interactions with the stone man didn't completely finish here. For a small fee, my great-grandmother, my grandmother, would watch children. By chance, she ended up taking in a young couple who had recently purchased a home in the neighborhood, which her own daughter and son-in-law had essentially just left after seeing what her daughter had seen. In order to avoid frightening the couple or discouraging them from hiring her, my great-grandmother didn't disclose this to them. She was a devout woman who genuinely believed that her daughter had just had a bad dream and had overreacted when she sold the house. As my gran and great-gran are having tea in my gran's new home a few weeks after she began watching the pair, my gran believes her mother is acting more subdued than normal. When she asks what's wrong, my great-grandfather seems a little reticent to explain. My gran persisted because she knew her mother, and eventually my great-gran revealed what had been bothering her. While the parents were away at work, my great-grandmother had been in the old house watching the small girl and boy. She inquired as to whether they had made friends at school and how they were finding life in this place. When the young girl answered, my great-grandfather's blood froze. The young girl claimed to have made a lifelong companion. That was excellent, my great-grandfather commented, and he inquired as to whether they lived nearby. He lived upstairs, according to the young girl. My great-grandmother simply shrugged her eyes and inquired about his personality, figuring it was an imaginary companion. The young girl claimed that he was formed of stone and would play with her in her bedroom before passing through the wall into her parents' bedroom. My great-grandfather couldn't speak. My grandmother became ill after she informed her of this. They eventually got a divorce after my grandmother discovered years later that Bill had been using a Ouija board in their first house and that he had grown so fixated on his studies and writings that he was becoming somewhat absent as a father. Even though they were still close friends, the marriage was failing, and even after Bill walked out, he was able to find a modest apartment a few blocks away. Moving didn't really help, as I mentioned, and even though my grandmother never saw the stone man again, the house they moved into turned out to be even more eventful. Because of her spirituality, my grandmother believes my grandfather opened a doorway for beings and energies to enter this realm, attach themselves to my family, and never returned. She is a little irritated, and I don't blame her. In addition to her own fear, her children and grandchildren would also experience fear and terror. However, years ago, her science teacher encouraged her to try it out as well. After meeting another man, my grandmother eventually married him. He is a wonderful, everyday man. I made the decision to realize a desire I've had since I was 10 years old this summer. I spent 3 months studying Japanese in Tokyo after moving there from Sweden. Now that I've been here for 7 weeks, I can't go a day without looking for flights home. The thing that haunts my room makes me utterly afraid. I won't waste words explaining the cultural clash that happens when a Swede moves to Japan, but I will outline some of the most pertinent initial reactions. In my experience, long-term travel is 30% your worst nightmare. Think 48-hour bus rides with food sickness. And 70% the most fantastic time of your life. Think lounging on a sunny beach, eating delicious food, and having no obligations. For me, those figures have improved as a result of this trip. During my first week, I spent every day seeing as much of Tokyo as I could, given my school was situated in a northern ward. My mind was filled with impressions, and I relished every moment of it. I adored the cuisine, the locals, the language, and the overall ambiance. My dorm was the only thing I didn't enjoy. I chose to live in the school dorm since it was affordable and practical. I shared a room with a lovely Thai girl who didn't know a word of English. On the day I moved in, we made an effort to speak Japanese, but it didn't work out very well, primarily because I could only speak Japanese well enough to ask questions like, "Where can I locate the post office?" and "How much is this?" phrases you rarely use while attempting to make new friends. With so few people to converse with, either Swedish or English, I began to feel lonely toward the end of my first week. The Thai lady I shared a room with had her group of friends over all the time, and they were so noisy that I couldn't concentrate when I was lying in bed studying or watching Netflix. To tell the truth, I was more envious than irritated. Even though I was 15 hours away from my loved ones, these girls seemed to be having a great time together. They spoke and joked a lot together whenever they were around, which made me miss my own pals even more. I had nowhere to go when I wanted to leave my room because the common area and kitchen of the dorm were always packed with people. I'm willing to acknowledge that I could have done more to establish friendships. However, I found the linguistic barrier to be too severe. It didn't help that anytime I walked into the kitchen or common room, everyone would stare at me, and the conversation would frequently pause for a few seconds. It wasn't going to last, that I wanted to stay away from both my room and the communal areas of the hostel. As of right now, the 70/30 long-term travel ratio was true. 30% detested my room, 70% fell in love with Tokyo. I chose to move out after 2 weeks since I had had enough. I went to my school for assistance because, as a non-Japanese national, it is quite difficult and frequently very expensive to find your own house in Tokyo. The lone staff member who could speak English called me a few days later and was thrilled to inform me that she had located an apartment I could rent, provided the school's representative signed the lease. The rent wasn't as exorbitant as I had anticipated, and the school was just 2 stations away on the Yamanote line, which runs through the heart of Tokyo's municipal traffic. That night, despite my roommate and her friends laughing uncontrollably while watching a K-drama on TV, I was so happy and pleased that I fell asleep right away after going to bed. I brought everything I owned in a large backpack on my back when I got to the flat the very next weekend. I was drenched in sweat and rainwater since it was the 3rd week of June and the weather was hot and muggy because the rainy season had just started. I missed the air conditioning in the flat since it was so different from the dry, chilly weather I was accustomed to in Sweden. I turned the doorknob, used my new key, and entered. The apartment was really small and smelled strangely damp. Fortunately, there were wooden flooring rather than tatami mats, which I didn't know how to clean, so I found it inconvenient. In the main room of the flat, I set down my big knapsack and started looking about. The main room had access to a 1-square-meter kitchen, and the little hallway led to a restroom and shower that were perhaps 1.5 square meters in size. Although the property could have benefited from some refurbishment, everything appeared to be in working order. The kitchen and bathroom had hot water, and the electricity was functioning perfectly. The walls were painted white, most likely 10 years ago or more, because there were yellow patches scattered throughout, and they were mildly discolored. 2 windows, larger than the Japanese norm, were located in the main chamber. Sun blinds made of metal hanging over them. There was a tiny window in the kitchen that was very near the ceiling, yet it added warmth to the small space. With a tiny table directly in front of it and a mattress on the floor in the main room, the flat was generally lightly furnished. It lacked a dining table, seats, and bookshelves. I settled in and began organizing my belongings in the Japanese-style closet built into the wall when I noticed a cabinet at the bottom of it. Although futon beds, sheets, and covers are frequently stored in cabinets in Japanese households, I had never seen one on the floor of a wardrobe before. I pushed my fingernails into the tiny space between the cabinet door and the closet floor in an attempt to open it, since I couldn't see a handle. I pulled upward after pushing my fingernails across the hatch's edge. It became stuck. Despite my best efforts, I was unable to unlock it. I swore aloud and gave up after getting a splinter under my index fingernail. After removing the pretty large splinter from my wounded finger, it itched for a few minutes. When I went to the landlord's office the following week to sign some insurance documents, I mentally noted that I should inquire about the cabinet. Why would anyone want a cabinet that wouldn't open? In my mind, a small voice replied, "At least not from the outside." I shivered at the thought. I choose to disregard it. I looked inside the cupboard above my bed and the other cabinets in the main room. I made a discovery. At the rear of the cabinet, something was resting on the bottom. I used my phone's flashlight to see because it was dark. I inserted my hand and extracted the item. It contained a lighter and a carton of smokes. Why had the previous occupant concealed this information and seemingly forgotten about it? But I had a terrible smoking habit when I was a teenager, but I was able to practically give it up after I was in my 20s. I only lit a cigarette on special occasions these days. I didn't recognize the Japanese brand of the black package. I packed it in my school bag without giving it any thought. After I finished my first Japanese exam, I might reward myself to one. I liked cupboards like this, dusty and presumably filled with stuff from past occupants, but at least I knew what they contained. What might be within the wardrobe's locked cabinet? I was thinking about an article I came across online a few years ago. For 6 years, a homeless Japanese woman resided in a man's apartment closet without him discovering. She would come out of the closet and take a tiny taste of everything in his refrigerator every day as he left for work. After a while, the man discovered that some food was missing, so he installed a camera to see how it happened. He reportedly sat directly in front of the closet and watched the movie where the women exited and then returned. I had no idea how terrified he must have been. That is, if the story is real. Cooking helps me unwind, and I quickly forgot about the cabinet when I was allowed to cook alone in my own kitchen. I boiled some rice, fried some meat and veggies, and made an omelet. I watched Rick and Morty episodes on my laptop while eating dinner on the main room floor. With the Rick and Morty episodes still playing in the background, I got up as soon as I was done and crossed the wooden floor to the little kitchen. Perhaps being in a busy dorm truly altered my taste in sounds since, for some reason, I found silence to be really unsettling. Something came from the other room as I was getting started on the dishes. I froze. Through the noise from my laptop, I could hear a very faint creaking sound. It was barely audible and sounded like something scraping at wood. I cautiously removed my cleaning gloves and took a quick look inside the adjacent room. Of course, there was none. I looked around the room to see where the noise was coming from and saw right once that it was coming from the wardrobe. I was covered with goosebumps. It sounded like a rat scratching at the locked door with its small yet pointed paws. Then it abruptly came to an end. Unaware that I had been holding my breath, I sighed deeply. I re-entered the kitchen. That kind of noise must have come from plumbing in the wall behind the closet. I wouldn't allow my imagination to create fantasies based on The Grudge or The Ring. I was going to stay in this apartment because I liked it. To ensure I wouldn't hear that scraping sound again, I put my headphones in before going to bed. I woke up around 3:30 in the morning. I reached for the remote control to turn off the air conditioner because I had overestimated its temperature and the room was now quite cold. Even though the room was dark, I placed the remote control on the floor next to my bed before turning in for the night. Fumbling in the dark, I fell. It was absent. I looked toward the closet because, for some reason, that's where my mind went. I was very relieved that it was closed. I climbed up and manually pressed a button to switch off the air conditioner. I heard a noise behind me as soon as I finished doing that. I moved swiftly. I couldn't see anyone, but it had sounded like faint footsteps on the wood floor. The room was rather dark, but through the sun blinds I had left open, some threads of light from the street signs outside came in. I returned to the bed slowly and carefully, and as I was ready to lay down, I heard something else. It was there. The closet made the same grinding noise. From the inside, a tiny, pointy object brushed against the closet door. Again and again. For about 3 or 4 seconds at first, there was silence. Then it began anew at the top of the door and began to draw down. It must be my imagination. I essentially threw myself into bed, pulled the duvet over my head, put on a Swedish podcast, plugged in my earbuds, and concluded that it was all a dream. It was absurd and terrifying to think that I had moved into a haunted Japanese flat. I was being foolish. I must be deceived by my imagination. Before I went to sleep, I attempted to convince myself that this flat was fantastic. I was still wearing my pajamas when I woke up in the morning. I felt as though I had woken up inside an oven because my room's air conditioning had been entirely switched off. As daylight streamed in through the window, I once more began looking for the AC remote control. I looked around the little room for a few minutes before getting out of bed and manually turning on the air conditioner. After eating breakfast and attending school, I had coffee with Hiro, a Japanese man who was my first true buddy. Despite being from Osaka, Hiro had spent 2 years in the US, which made speaking English relatively simple. He and I had met at a university after-school club. Although I didn't bring up the strange things that had happened in my flat the previous evening, he was quite approachable. But I did let him know that I had moved out of the dorm and had a place of my own. When I informed him which neighborhood I currently resided in, he got really pleased, since it turned out that his grandmother lived just 3 blocks from my apartment. Given Tokyo's size, this was a rather amazing coincidence. We said our goodbyes, and I left for home after Hiro assured me he would stop by the next time he was seeing his grandmother. I was standing at my front door when the raindrops poured silently on my umbrella. Despite my uneasiness, I turned the doorknob and entered. I went inside and shut the door after shaking off the majority of the water from the umbrella. As soon as the door automatically locked, it clicked. As I put goods in the kitchen, I hurriedly turned on the lights in the main room, took my laptop out of my bag, and turned on some music. I opened the closet once again and gazed at the cabinet at the bottom before turning in for the night. I attempted to bend it open from several angles with a dull knife, but the cabinet didn't seem to move at all. I sighed deeply, gave up, and went to sleep. I suddenly woke up at 3 o'clock. Once more I heard a sound. The sound of light footsteps tapping on the wood floor. My hands were sore from cold perspiration that I could hardly grasp my phone. I'm not sure why, but it just made me feel safer. Like, even though I was definitely alone in there, I wasn't alone. Correct? No one else could be there, could there? I glanced in the direction of the front entrance. It remained closed. I then peeked in the closet after turning my head back. The cabinet was ajar. My heart began to race, and I felt shivers down my spine. Wilt, this actually happened. In fact, there was something haunting the place. I cautiously peered into the cabinet. 2 cups were filled with a dark gray liquid, sitting on the shelves. There wasn't much room down there, and it was really dirty. It emitted a peculiar odor, akin to the scent of damp mold combined with charred wood. I leaned over the cabinet and peered down into the small, dim room, my heart thumping in my chest. An adapt thing that didn't seem to belong was at the bottom of the cabinet, surrounded by dust, long black hair, and other types of grime. It was smooth and light gray in tone, the air conditioning remote control. It was like a flash of insight. It seemed to enjoy playing games, whatever it was that lived in the dirty cabinet. I retreated a step, and as a million ideas raced through my mind, I followed my impulse to the letter and slammed the closet door. I tried, actually. It wouldn't shut for some reason. I pushed as hard as I could with both hands on it, but something prevented it from shutting. After pressing for a few seconds, I began to stare along the door's edge. When my eyes came to rest on the right corner, I let out a loud cry and took off running backwards. A tiny hand was present. A tiny hand emerges from the wardrobe. The 4 fingers were firmly grasping the door's edge. I doubt I would have spotted it if I hadn't turned on the lights earlier, but it was there. The flesh on the knuckles was pale, with faint blue veins showing through the white skin and black dirt surrounding each fingernail. It appeared as though it might have belonged to a young child. I felt queasy, knowing that I must have squeezed those little fingers in the door opening so forcefully. The tiny hand released the door and pulled back into the closet right in front of my eyes. I lost my train of thought. My eyes began to well up with silent tears. After over a minute of sitting motionless and gazing at the closet, I got up and went to the restroom. I had some rather potent sleeping medications because of a knee injury I had sustained 2 years prior. I took 3 tablets and then dozed off on the shower floor. I believe I heard those faint footsteps on the wooden floor in the adjacent room once more before I fell asleep. After 10 hours, I woke up with severe physical aches. My limbs were all hurting from the hard bathroom floor, and I had been sleeping in the fetal position. I felt terrible when I realized that I had already missed the most of the school day. I felt much worse when I thought about why I had slept in the bathroom in the first place. My brain was functioning more slowly than usual due to the effects of the sleeping medications. When I emerged from the restroom, the other room didn't seem as ominous as it had at night in the afternoon sunlight. Perhaps the medication had interfered with my ability to think clearly. I had a big glass of water since my throat hurt and my mouth felt dry. As soon as the water ran down my throat, life seemed to slowly come back to me. I ended up sitting in front of the closet door, staring at it and rubbing my temples as I drank another glass of water. I suppose there was only one way to know, but it couldn't have been a dream, could it? I resolutely swallowed the remaining water. Expecting it to appear as it had before the cabinet was opened, I threw open the closet door. I was shocked to find the cabinet still open. As it had done during the night, it was showing its dark and filthy interior. After all, it couldn't have been a dream. I started to close the wardrobe door since I didn't want to glance down in that dirty cabinet once more. When I spotted something in the closet that made me cringe, I paused. It was gloomy inside even with the lights on, and now that it was light outside, I saw something on the cabinet's tiny door. The square door I had struggled so hard to open earlier was now standing straight, revealing to me the side of the door that faced the interior of the cabinet when it was closed. It had some marks on it. The wood has long, thin slices. Dark brown stains coated the deepest incisions. The long, thin markings initially appeared to be a cutout pattern, but I had to stoop to view them well. In the process, I grabbed the closet door's doorknob and unintentionally hit my index finger, which had sustained a massive splinter the previous evening. Helvee! On reaction, I yelled violently, but then I froze in dread. I glanced at my finger before turning my attention to the odd markings on the cabinet door's interior. Little fingers, probably splintered and bleeding, had attempted to rip the door from the inside out. The sound of a tiny object scraping against wood. Someone had been inside the cabinet. Someone with very small hands, possibly a youngster, based on the size of the marks. Similar to the tiny hand that prevented me from shutting the closet door yesterday, I felt as though I had been doused with ice. Panic overcame me, and I had to bite my lip to keep from screaming aloud once more. After getting dressed, I began gathering all of my essential possessions. I noticed something close to my bed when I pulled my charger out of the power outlet. It was the air conditioner's remote control. It had mysteriously returned while I was sleeping on the bathroom floor. I pictured the small, filthy hand placing it there in my mind. I walked out of the apartment right away. I'm currently in a Ueno cafe. I texted Hiro to let her know that I needed a place to rest tonight due to an emergency. He said he would meet me here in around 3 hours, but he was busy at work. During those hours, I wrote down my experiences from the previous several days. I had intended to attach a photo of the cabinet, but my phone kept shutting off whenever I attempted. It's either that or whatever's inside doesn't want to be seen on camera because the battery has been a little shady recently. I'll try to snap a new photo when I have to return eventually.